The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Debate Review Part 2 for Matt Dillahunty versus Matt Slick. Is secular humanism superior to Christianity? There's a lot to get to in this debate, which is strange considering in the previous part I mentioned that my opponent really didn't address the topic. But he certainly did say a lot of things, and so I want to make sure I get to those. In this section, we'll be going through the opening statements from each of us, and in the third section, we'll go through the Q&A portions. I have no idea how long this will be, and if I have to divide it up, well, we'll divide it up. My thinking going into this debate, when we finally settled on the topic, is secular humanism superior to Christianity, I was overjoyed. I really looked forward to this. And my plan for my opening statement was to present a 30-minute opening statement that was so perfect, that was so great, that covered secular humanism so well that it could just be ripped right out of the debate and put out as a, welcome to secular humanism, here's everything you need to know. Now, I didn't get anywhere near that. I like the opening that I presented, and I'll go through portions of this to show what I did and why, but I didn't get anywhere near that. It was kind of a pipe dream to say that, oh, well, I'm going to produce the 30-minute introduction to humanism that's going to be used over and over again. That's just not the way this works in debate, but having that as a goal, I think made me focus on what I needed to say and to do my best to present secular humanism and its benefits and its superiority to other potential worldviews and strategies in a way that was at least good for the debate and hopefully would educate some people. Now, I don't have any delusions about it convincing Matt Slick or even many of the Christians who were there in the room, but hopefully it gave them something to think about. As I went through my opening, I wanted to start, and I did start, by stating the question of the debate and talking about how this was something I could give a clear yes to. I'm excited for this debate in particular because I'm now defending a position that I believe and care strongly about. A question where my answer is a clear yes, and where I presume Matt Slick's answer is a clear no. Maybe not. Is secular humanism superior to Christianity? Yes. The reason for this is that Matt seemed to be incredibly frustrated that we would have discussions about things where I wouldn't give a clear yes or I wouldn't give a clear no. He's very uncomfortable, as are many theists and many apologists, with this idea of I don't know, or let's have a discussion about the nuance in the terms so that we can be clear that we're actually in agreement about what we're talking about. So I wanted to say, is secular humanism superior to Christianity? And give a yes, and I did that. We discussed the definitions, and I noted what I did or didn't agree with. Prior to the debate, as Matt points out, and as I did as well, I'd mentioned that, you can go to secularhumanism.org or one of these other sites, and by and large, I'll agree with it, but that there were specific things that I didn't agree with. I needed to make sure in my opening that not only did I present the case for why secular humanism was superior, but why it was specifically superior to Christianity, as Matt was going to represent it. And the other goal is to try to preemptively shut down specific objections that are born of confusion. So I made sure that I pointed out that my position is not one of philosophical naturalism. It's not an assertion that the natural world is all that exists. I am instead a methodological naturalist. I recognize that we cannot appeal to the supernatural because we don't have any way to access it or even show that it's real or investigate whether or not it can cause anything. And so my naturalism is a methodological one, not a philosophical one. Now, it's worth noting my position is not based on the assumption or conclusion that the supernatural is not real. That's not what this is based on. It's not what I'm saying. My position is based on the recognition that the supernatural hasn't been demonstrated, and so we can't rely on it for answers or appeals until we have a good method to show that we can, in fact, access this. And there's a few things that Matt talked about, which we'll get to in his opening, where he went to the secularhumanism.org website, where he apparently misread what was actually there or ignored context there. But we'll get to those as well. We defined Christianity in the opening, but we didn't really talk about its goals or methods, and I was hoping that Matt would present something about its goals and methods that would allow us to contrast. I went over Matt's definition of Christianity, and I'll put it up for you here.
Matt Slick's working definition of Christianity is a religion based upon the teachings and miracles of Jesus, as recorded primarily in the New Testament. Jesus is the anointed one from God the Father who came to this world, fulfilled the Old Testament laws and prophecies, died on the cross bearing our sins, and rose from the dead physically. Jesus is divine in nature as well as human. Thus, he has two natures and is worthy of worship and prayer. A person cannot be a Christian if that person denies the deity of Christ, his sacrifice on the cross, his physical resurrection, and justification faith alone in Christ alone.
It doesn't really tell us anything. It doesn't tell us anything about Christianity as a worldview or strategy. It's all about what one must do to become a Christian or to be a Christian. Or actually, the way it's written, it's about what you can't believe and still be a Christian. It doesn't even tell you what you need to believe. I also wanted to make it clear that my position was not merely about morality, that secular humanism as a worldview is a philosophical position that covers everything, not just ethics and morality. And so if we spent time on moral questions, that secular humanism isn't pretending that it has the answers to everything, just that it has methods which are the most reliable or more reliable than religions in making sure that we find the best answers and that we hold positions tentatively. I talked about how we need to be talking about an area where Christianity and secular humanism overlap. This was the canned peaches portion of the opening statement, and this is something that Matt agreed to, which I thought was great. There were a number of things that made me incredibly optimistic about this debate. Matt would agree with this, Matt would agree with that, and then he would go off on a tangent about logical absolutes. In my opening, I also wanted to make sure that I pointed out that absolute certainty isn't relevant. I don't think you can be absolutely certain about anything. But if we listen, when we go through some of Matt's positions, there's a hidden appeal to absolute certainty as an undercurrent through everything that he says. Instead of talking about whether one strategy is better than another, he talks about whether or not it's true. And he talks about, if you can't provide a grounding for why reason is reasonable, well, basically, in that case, he's saying if you can't be absolutely certain about this, rather than reasonably certain, rather than recognizing that we have a presupposition and we compare things to what we've presupposed, but his entire case, I think there's an absolute certainty hidden in every single thing that he says. And it's phrased differently. It's not always absolute certainty. But we'll take a look at that when we get to his opening statement. When we talk about whether or not secular humanism is superior to Christianity as a strategy for life, the one thing that I wanted to do was to show that you don't have, not only is absolute certainty not required, but you don't have to have absolutes or standards of measures, that you can comparatively evaluate things. So I gave examples of things that we do that don't necessarily require some absolute method. I talked about building a stool where you might want legs that are 19 inches or you might want them that are higher than a person, but the important thing is that the legs be the same length, and so there are ways to cut them relative to each other that don't require any measuring at all. Every measurement for human flourishing could also be relative. And at one point in the opening, I said relevant when I meant relative. So there is a complete error in there in what I actually said compared to what I meant. But I gave examples like, even if prayer worked in the sense of we said a prayer and something happened, knowing that doesn't increase our understanding. It doesn't add to our understanding, and it doesn't give us a method by which we can better understand the world. So I wanted to compare and contrast the goals and methods of Christianity and secular humanism. And I wanted to end by pointing out one thing that I find absolutely damning about all of this. and that is that there is nothing within secular humanism that could lead to slavery or killing. The foundational principles of autonomy and human flourishing and equality are in direct opposition to these things. And the same is not true for Christianity. So let's take a look at what Matt had to say in his opening statement.
For all for coming here, thank you. I really appreciate being able to defend what I believe is the truth about the Word of God. It's a great honor and a privilege to do that.
So there's a lot to get to in Matt's opening statement, and I'll be doing it in voiceover so that I can quickly edit back and forth and add commentary. But his opening remark here is that it's an honor and privilege to be able to come here to defend what he believes about the Word of God. I'm not going to fault somebody for quick opening remarks, but I will point out that he never actually defends what he believes. He just states what he believes. And in a debate about whether secular humanism is superior to Christianity, what he believes about the Word of God is irrelevant as to whether or not it's a better strategy. And so his only requirement is to show that secular humanism isn't, in fact, superior to Christianity. And his entire debate strategy centers around claiming that secular humanism is self-refuting and therefore cannot be superior to Christianity.
Now, in order for one thing to be superior to another, we must have common categories. Matt, good job. I agree. Now, we can't compare if you don't have common categories. And this comparison should avoid logical fallacies, and it should avoid emotional appeals. We also need a standard by which we can judge among those categories. Now, this is important. But the standard cannot be arbitrary, and it must be compatible with both worldviews.
So we begin with agreement that we must have common categories in order to compare our respective strategies to see which one is better. But Matt makes a mistake right at the outset that betrays his thinking about absolutes, about truth, and it's an attempt, perhaps not intentionally, but an attempt nevertheless to poison the well, because he says that the common category cannot be arbitrary. Well, that's simply not true. One could say that the rules of chess or any other game are arbitrary, but the origin of the rules of the game are a completely separate question from whether or not a particular strategy is better at achieving the goals in accordance with that standard. So to begin by saying, oh, well, the standard can't be arbitrary, is simply wrong.
Now, secular humanism, according to it, is philosophically naturalistic. It holds that nature, the world of everyday physical experience, is all there is, and that reliable knowledge is best obtained when we query nature using the scientific method. Naturalism asserts that supernatural entities like God do not exist and warns us that knowledge gained without appeal to the natural world and without impartial review by multiple observers is unreliable. Now, I want to read Matt's position here because it's short and sweet. I like that. A worldview that seeks to discover and utilize the best methods to encourage ethical, robust, productive human interactions in societies by appealing to naturalistic evidence and reasoned arguments instead of religious dogma and supernatural foundations. Now, within that is the necessarily drawn conclusion that his worldview must exclude God. Doesn't mean he's denying God. Just a bit of logic here. He may or may not believe in God from that definition. It's just that secular humanism means this. Basically, God is not considered in the equation.
Now, this last comment from Matt and this screen grab from secularhumanism.org leads to a big problem that I have with what Matt does and all of the confusion. There's a big confusion between philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. And Matt, based on what he just said, understands the distinction and understands that I'm not necessarily advocating for philosophical naturalism, and even seems to understand that secular humanism as a whole doesn't necessarily hold to philosophical naturalism, despite what this paragraph says, that the core of it is if we're going to be making decisions and we don't have access to the supernatural, we cannot make appeals to the supernatural. So he understands this and portrays himself as understanding it, and yet at different points throughout the debate, he argues against philosophical naturalism while ignoring what he's just acknowledged about methodological naturalism. And it's difficult for me to ding him too harshly for this when the very language of this paragraph might end up being problematic. It might be that they've over-asserted what secular humanism needs to be about, or added to confusion about the distinction between philosophical and methodological naturalism. The problem here is that Matt understands the difference. He understands what my position is. He understands that I specifically, repeatedly said I wasn't going to be defending philosophical naturalism. And even after acknowledging this distinction, goes on to make argument after argument based on this assumption that secular humanism is declaring the supernatural does not exist in order to set up what appears to be, from his perspective, a self-refuting position.
Now, at this point, I propose that one philosophical position cannot be superior to another, no matter what criteria we use to determine superiority, if that philosophical position is self-refuting. Now, you get my point?
So here we are just a couple of moments later, after saying that you couldn't have an arbitrary standard, and Matt is now saying that a worldview, a strategy, could not be superior no matter what criteria is used if it's self-refuting. Well, let's set aside whether or not we've defined self-refuting or whether or not we've shown that a worldview is self-refuting, because I don't think that's going to happen at all. But he's simply wrong. It is the criteria that matters. If you're talking about the fitness of a strategy, which is what we're talking about whether secular humanism as a strategy for human flourishing is superior to Christianity as a strategy for human flourishing. It doesn't matter whether it's arbitrary that we've selected on human flourishing. This is what we're comparing it to. And it doesn't matter if you can point to some other aspect of secular humanism or Christianity and make a claim that it's self-refuting or even demonstrate it. It could still be the better, superior strategy with regard to that criteria. So he's not only trying to set aside this idea that you could arbitrarily pick a criteria, which is wrong, you can, but he's also saying that no matter what the criteria is, if the position is self-refuting in some other aspect, then it can't possibly be superior. And that's simply wrong.
That if Christianity is self-refuting and makes no sense, it can't be true, and it can't be superior to anything else if it's not true. The same thing applies to secular humanism.
And this is where we begin to see some of Matt's difficulties in distinguishing between whether or not something is true and whether or not something is superior to something else that may or may not be true. He says if Christianity is self-refuting, it can't be true, and therefore it can't be superior. But whether or not Christianity is true is completely separate from whether or not it is superior to something else, whether that something else is true or not. Two things could be untrue, and one could still be superior. If your model of the universe has Earth at the center, and my model of the universe has Jupiter at the center, but also includes a firmament barrier and makes other mistakes, your model is superior to mine. We're comparing two things. And in comparing two things, those two worldviews are what are relevant, not some appeal to truth. Now, you can think the world's flat. You're wrong. The world's not flat. But viewing the world as flat can be really good for city planning, for, making sure that buildings are level. And because in localized areas, the curvature of the earth is largely irrelevant. And what you care about there is the topography of the local region. So you could have a worldview that is false, and it still produces better results than some other worldview that's false, and perhaps even better results than a worldview that is more true. Whether or not the foundations of a particular view are true is completely separate from whether or not worldview A is superior to worldview B with respect to achieving the goals. But Matt wants to disregard the goals. Matt wants to disregard you can't have arbitrary standards, and something can't be superior no matter what the criteria is when it's the criteria that matter. What matters is whether or not it's true, and if I think I found a way to show that your worldview can't be true, then I win. But that's not the way this works. Because superiority of a worldview is a relative comparison to another worldview and not a comparison to an absolute. The claim isn't that secular humanism is true and perfect, or that Christianity is true and perfect. The issue of the debate is which one of these two is superior, irrespective of whether or not they are true, because obviously I don't think that Christianity is true either, but I'm willing to consider its methods and its goals and its results relative to the methods, goals, and results of secular humanism, and comparing those with the goal of human flourishing. It's a relative assessment, not a question of truth.
To reiterate, if something is self-refuting, it cannot be superior to something that is not self-refuting, since that which is self-refuting cannot be true.
Now, I'm not going to post every time he makes this same statement. I wanted to include this because it's short, it's clear, and it shows that this wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This is his case. If something is self-refuting, it cannot be true. If something is not true, it cannot be superior to something else. This appeal to truth permeates everything that he talks about. He doesn't consider in this statement whether or not the something else might also not be true or might also be self-refuting. But we also haven't clearly defined self-refuting, and the case that he's going to make for secular humanism being self-refuting is that secular humanism can't account for the logical absolutes, can't account for the foundations of reason, which is essentially the same thing, cannot account for the reliability of reasoning, and cannot solve the problem of induction, yet it relies on science. And he's going to make appeals that this is a faith-based position and all of these other things. But at the end of the day, his claim is secular humanism can't account for reason and science, therefore it's self-refuting. Well, I'm sorry, but I've tried, and I cannot find a syllogism that leads to that conclusion. And he doesn't present one. He just claims that secular humanism is self-refuting.
Now, on that secular humanist website, as I quoted earlier, it says that humanism is a philosophically naturalistic, or it is philosophically naturalistic, in hopes that nature, parentheses, the world of everyday physical experience is all there is, and that naturalism is all there is, and that, quote, naturalism asserts that supernatural entities like God do not exist. Now, I found very interesting, now I'm not accusing Matt, whoever he is, of believing this, but I noticed this on the website. It says the word hope. We hope. So secular humanism, apparently by this definition, hopes that the natural world is all there is.
So I would agree with Matt that it would be strange for the definition of secular humanism at the secularhumanism.org website to say secular humanism is philosophically naturalistic in hopes that nature is all there is. That's not what it says now. I can't tell you if somebody went and changed it or if they went and changed it because of what Matt said. I can tell you that I went to the Wayback Machine on the internet to look at older versions of the pages, and all of those came up saying it holds that nature, the world of everyday physical experience, is all there is. But this is also a PHP-generated page, so I don't know if the Wayback Machine is, actually showing me what it said 6 months ago, or if it's just pulling up the script and I'm still getting the new information. I can't really say. What I can say is we can completely disregard this entire line of thought about hope because, at a minimum, that's not what the page says now. So if he launched a legitimate objection and somebody agreed and changed it, then he was right. And it never really represented the secular humanist position.
Now, this is an important thing for you to understand. You've got to get this concept. You see, if our physical brains are limited to operating under the laws of physics and chemistry, then we need to ask how such physical mechanisms produce proper logical inference. In other words, how does one chemical state in the brain that leads to another chemical state in the brain produce proper logical inference? When baking soda reacts with vinegar, does it produce logic? No. When the brain is far more complex than that, and it contains many chemicals and complex wiring, neurochemical wiring, it's still a machine. It's still a set of chemicals. Even though it's more complex, does it then produce proper logical inference in a specifically naturalistic worldview where the physical brain is restricted to the laws of chemistry and physics? And this is important. The laws of logic are not the same thing as the laws of physics. They're not derived from the laws of physics. They're different than that. I argue this a lot. They're different. How can, in the secular humanist worldview that presupposes the idea that God is not there, and therefore is not allowed to be in the equation, therefore necessitating a physical realm, how do you justify in that position that your logical inferences in your brain could be trusted? But remember, it's this chemical reaction that leads to chemical reaction. This becomes self-refuting because you cannot trust that the chemical reactions are producing truth. It produces a reaction. It doesn't mean your reaction that you produce, and here's my reaction, I don't like you, is something that is right or wrong. It's just a chemical reaction. And because of that, you can't trust it. Therefore, right there, the whole principle is self-refuting because you couldn't even know if secular humanism is true because it's just a chemical reaction.
So here's where we get into the part of the debate that really irritated a lot of people. Why does he keep talking about brain fizz? We talked about it during the Q&A, during the cross-examination. It's just brain fizz, and he's going to mention it many, many times. And it's because the argument is silly and I would say unsound, although he would need to put it into a little bit better structure to properly analyze it. But what he's saying is, if baking soda and vinegar don't produce proper logical inference, and that's a chemical reaction, then how can you think that brains, being just a chemical reaction, could produce proper logical inference? Well, one could point out that other chemical reactions don't produce the fizz that baking soda and vinegar produce. So how could you possibly say that baking soda and vinegar could produce fizz if mixing water and Kool-Aid mix doesn't produce fizz? There's a problem with both the structure and content of this argument, but the case that he's making is really a normal presupp case, except it's muddled. He's saying secular humanism can't account for why reason is reasonable. Well, first of all, that's not a task of secular humanism. Secular humanism is founded upon reason, but doesn't claim to be an explanation for why reason is reasonable. Why are logical truths true? Or are they true? The fact that you can't explain how a chemical reaction could ever produce reasoning is separate from whether or not, if you begin with the presupposition, the unavoidable recognition that we are in fact thinking machines, and you don't claim to know why or how we are thinking machines, but that we are, and this is demonstrable, it's not a fault of the secular humanist worldview, or even the various philosophical worldviews that serve as foundations for epistemology and reasoning. It's not the fault of them that they don't explain why this is the case. Presuppositionalists claim to have solutions to the hardest problems in philosophy. They claim that their worldview can offer a grounding account for these things, and no other worldview can. And they never bother to demonstrate that their worldview actually can, and they certainly never bother to demonstrate that no other worldview can. We seem to be in this world where we are stuck presupposing reason, as do the Christians, as do the presuppositionalist apologists. But they claim that they found a foundation for it. All of our evaluations of correct logical reasoning are done by comparing the structure and products of thoughts, the arguments, within the rules that we presuppose about reason. And the weird thing is that Matt and I agree on these rules. We agree on, the foundations of reason. We agree that reason is reasonable. We probably don't agree to the same extent because I don't make appeals to absolute certainty. But he is so bound to appeals of absolute certainty and claims of truth that he can't see past this. How do we determine that the products of our brain are consistent with the laws of logic? Well, this is demonstrable. You can point to a logically constructed argument and say, this is invalid in structure. Or you can say this premise is not accepted or it's demonstrably false. And so the objection here isn't that our brains can't reason correctly. He's not saying that we can't reason correctly. He's saying secular humanism cannot be certain that reason is reasonable. This is yet another appeal to absolute certainty. And this is something that Hobbes pointed out to Descartes with the cogito ergo sum, that the entire argument of I think therefore I am still has the problem that in order for that to be the case, reason has to be reasonable. This gets into a twisting, turning thing that most people don't want to get involved in. Most people are like, well, of course reason's reasonable. It's just, de facto. It may be even calling it properly basic. In truth, it's a presupposition, but it's a presupposition that continues to be useful and demonstrate its accuracy with respect to the world that we experience. You can point out logical fallacies, you can point out errors in thought, and you can demonstrate why they are inconsistent with the laws of logic and why they aren't likely to lead to accurate models of the world. The problem here is that his worldview can't solve this problem either. Like all precepts, he claims that it can, and he claims that it's the only one it can, but never gets around to demonstrating it. His issue here is that naturalism cannot give me an explanation for reason. It can't give me an explanation for why we should trust reason. It can't offer a solution to the problem of hard solipsism. It can't offer a solution to the problem of induction that it sits at the foundation of science. Therefore, anything based on secular humanism can't be true. Well, first of all, the fact that a worldview doesn't account for something doesn't tell you whether or not that worldview is true. And you're presuming that there is an account for this. You're also presuming that you have found the account for this. But I see no reason to think that it may not be the case, or it may be the case that there is no explanation for this, that this is just the way things are, and that this seeking for a warranted foundation, a grounding for these things, is an exercise in futility. But setting that aside, all of this is irrelevant as to whether or not the strategies within secular humanism are superior to strategies in some other worldview with respect to human flourishing. Because you could pick another worldview that maybe is concerned with human flourishing and maybe demonstrably true, but it hasn't worked out the strategies well enough. It doesn't know enough about the world. So in a debate about whether secular humanism is superior to Christianity, why are we spending any time talking about the laws of logic, the foundations of reason? This is all of his attempt to claim that secular humanism is self-refuting. The big problem here is that secular humanism doesn't claim to solve these problems, and so it can't be self-refuting. It's not that secular humanists are saying, we've cracked it, and then there's a demonstration that we're wrong. See, for something to be self-refuting, it needs to lead to a contradiction. What Matt's trying to say is that secular humanism leads to, you don't understand how or why this works. But that's not a contradiction. Recognizing that we don't have a foundation for this, that we don't have an explanation for this, is not a contradiction. And it doesn't make self-refuting arguments. Secular humanism isn't self-refuting merely because Matt thinks that it can't account for something that he can account for. But does he offer any defense of how he escapes this problem, how he grounds reason?
It means you cannot trust your brain to produce proper logical inference because it's just reacting chemically.
And this is the fallacy. You can't trust your brain if it's merely a chemical reaction. There's an implication there that you could trust your brain if there's more than a chemical reaction going on, yet there's no demonstration of that. There's no demonstration of what would be required to make it reasonable to trust your brain. What do we have to add to it other than his appeals constantly to absolute certainty? Where's the demonstration that chemical reactions cannot be reasonable? He's basically just saying, if you can't account for it, you can't trust that it's reliable. Well, that's not true. If we're playing chess and my strategy doesn't offer an explanation for the rules, indeed, if I don't even know why the rules are what they are, that has no bearing on whether or not my strategy is superior. And it doesn't mean that I have no reason to think that my strategy is superior, because the strategy is about comparing the results to the goal. Matt Slick is constantly trying to tie things back to some absolute truth when what we're talking about is a relative comparison with respect to rules and goals that we share and agree upon. Later on, he's going to acknowledge, he cares about human flourishing. And of course, he's already acknowledged that we can use reason, and he thinks that reason is reliable. He just doesn't think that we can account for whether reason is reliable. And I think he's right. I just don't think that he can solve the problem either. Instead of actually considering the subject, he starts at the top of this slippery slope by saying, oh, well, if you can't be absolutely certain, then you can't trust it. And then it's all just brain fizz, as if a lack of certainty necessarily results in unreliable gibberish. This is the foundation of his entire argument against secular humanism. This debate is supposed to be about which is a better strategy for human flourishing in life, given the rules that we agree on, given the truths that we agree on. And instead, it is, well, I'm going to ignore everything you've said about strategy. I'm going to ignore every problem. I'm just going to knock the pieces all over the board and say, hey, you can't explain how the rules of chess became the rules of chess. You can't explain why reason is reasonable. Therefore, you have no reason to think you're actually being reasonable. And yet, curiously, we're able to have a conversation and evaluate arguments. So he can operate within the realm of this, but it seems that he can only do so because he's convinced that he has an explanation for why reason is reasonable. And he's aware that I can operate in the same realm, but I don't have that explanation. This is the crux of everything within the presup line of thought. We've solved the problem. You can't trust your brain if it's just a chemical reaction. Well, that's an interesting claim. Now please back it up, because the only way that they've even attempted to back it up is to say, well, you can't be absolutely certain. Well, like many other people who have studied epistemology and philosophy, I'm not convinced that there's absolute certainty about anything, and I'm not convinced that it matters. If in fact we can't be absolutely certain, then all of our evaluations are relative with respect to some standard, and it doesn't matter if the standard is arbitrary. And Matt's tried to cut all of that out from the beginning.
Now, someone could say, well, Matt, you're wrong. Your brain made you say that. I don't care what you say, Matt, you're wrong. Your brain just made you say that again. Just stimulus, chemical reaction. You know what? You're wrong, Matt. You're stupid, you're ugly. Your brain made you say that.
Your brain made you say that. Yes, it did. Depending on how you want to look at brain-to-mind interaction. The question, though, isn't whether or not my brain made me say it, but is what I said correct or incorrect? Is it reasonable or unreasonable? If I've said something and I've offered an argument, I'm expecting some sort of evaluation of it. This is the portion of the debate that I find most dishonest, because he recognizes and flatly states that non-believers can use reason, and that we agree that reason is reasonable, but in response to counter-arguments against his position, he, when pressed, falls back to, your brain made you say that. We'll see this in the Q&A portion as well. It's just dismissive. This merely dismisses the content of the argument. The actual substance that we're supposed to be talking about is just disregarded. It's not a reasoned response. It's a dismissal that is equivalent to, I hear you, but I'm not going to spend one moment considering your position and whether it's consistent with reason and evidence. Instead, I'm just going to reassert my claim that you cannot, according to my worldview, have any foundation to think that you're right. So I'll just pretend that it's equivalent of gibberish, and then I don't have to do the hard work of actually considering what you've said. One of the key differences between the two of us and our worldviews and methods of arguing is that whether or not your brain made you say that, I actually care about what was said and want to consider and evaluate your position rather than just climbing back into a presuppositionalist shell and hiding from the possibility that I might actually be mistaken. When the questions get difficult and might expose that presuppositionalists haven't made their case or that they're on no firmer footing than the rest of us, they bow out of the conversation in a way that seems superior to them, but to those who actually care about the content of what brains produce, seems not far removed from, oh yeah, well, my dad could beat up your dad. If someone says, please evaluate my physics homework, and your response is, your physics homework isn't relevant because you can't account for why the laws of physics are as they are, is it reasonable to expect them to care about your opinion on the topic in the future? In the next part of this review, we'll finish up Matt Slick's opening statement. There's a lot more to go through, and we'll talk a little bit about the cross-examination period. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.